our question is a very simple one. Who will replace Nicola Sturgeon? Before we go sort of into the runners and riders, I think it's really interesting because she sort of represents the end of that generation who forged their sort of nationalist credentials in a time of adversity. And now whoever takes over is going to have to be part of that new generation who actually has to rule a devolved country and get to grips with some of those public services that we were talking about. So it will represent a complete shift, I think, in the kind of leadership that the SNP has. I mean, is that fair to say, Chris, or will they try and sort of have Nicola Sturgeon 2.0?
Well, it kind of depends on who they select, because they have options now in terms of the age of the leader, the generation of the leader, which way the leader might lean in terms of fundamentalism versus gradualism. And I don't think it's clear yet which way they're likely to go. It's too early to say. I mean, we can all remember what happened in the contest between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, which is that the membership chose the option that tickled their bellies more adroitly. I don't know, the makeup of the SNP membership who will ultimately make the choice, whether someone who promises a more rushes at the barricades, a more urgent demand for independence might actually be what they want, rather than someone who will perhaps reconsider the nature of the SNP and government, the nature of the independence campaign, and think that perhaps that Salmon Sturgeon generation that you talked about, Anoosh, that they've had their goal, they've maxed out at a bit under 50%, and that how much further will the politics of grievance, the politics of shouting at Westminster, the politics of trying to make Scotland look and feel different from England, when actually, small c conservative Scotland, the middle bit, is not all that different from small c conservative England. So those are decisions that will need to be taken, and they'll be taken by people who are members of the SNP. And the reason people are members of the SNP is that they want independence. That's why people join. It's not because of their education policy or their health policy or really their trans policy. So it's quite hard to predict it at the moment. There are some interesting contenders. We can talk about some of them. From my perspective, there needs to be a generational shift. They've been in government for best part of 16 years. They've done a lot of things they want to do. They've had a referendum. They've spent the last 8 years trying desperately to have another referendum. Scottish people aren't against having a referendum, but they don't want one now. There's always a sort of 3 to 5 year horizon when the pollsters ask them when they'd like to see a referendum, and it feels a bit like a break glass in emergency sort of approach among a lot of voters, that if things went too crazy at Westminster, or they just keep it in their back pocket, they'd have that option. But most people don't want a referendum tomorrow. They didn't want one on whenever it was, October the 19th, the date that Sturgeon had set for a second referendum. I think they need to rediscover their patience, their strategic patience, which was one of the big reasons behind the SNP's success over the last 20, 30 years, really since Alex Salmond first became leader in 1990. And I think this is a bit like that moment, because Salmond transformed the SNP at that point from a bit of a ragtag into a quite clearly defined social democratic pro-European project. I think we're now at the stage where there needs to be a similar kind of rethink, not to necessarily move away from that, but to think about a new approach to securing independence, how you win over that bit of middle Scotland, because shouting at them and trying to scare them into voting for independence clearly isn't going to work, or it would have worked by now post-Brexit and after 12, 13 years of increasingly radical Tory governments.
So, Freddie, take us through some of the names, because you and Zoe wrote a list of runners and riders, which listeners can read on our website.
Yeah, so it's worth noting that this changes. We put Stephen Flynn up there, one of the Westminster leader, the newly crowned Westminster leader. And I think Sturgeon's resignation probably came a little bit too early for him. He was probably kicking himself. If it was a bit further down the line, maybe he would be able to, shuffle up to Scotland and try and get that job. But for instance, he's ruled himself out for the moment. I mean,
yeah, I did wonder if it was a bit come and get me if you need me.
Yeah.
I'm sure they could find him a seat if they needed to.
Yeah. Rachel interviewed him, I think, at the start of the year, which is definitely worth reading. He says, if any SNP politician wants to be in Scotland's Parliament, which is in Edinburgh, it's not in Westminster. So his priorities are quite clear, and his direction of travel, I think, is quite clear. But no, not him. Kate Forbes, one of the finance secretary, who has been on maternity leave for the past few months. I mean, Chris, we were speaking about this before we came on, but she has quite socially conservative views. She's quite religious. She managed, though, to avoid the gender reform debate because she was on maternity leave, which we
perfectly timed.
Otherwise, you might have gone into there might have been some conflict between her and Sturgeon, which ultimately may have ended up with her resignation. The list is huge, I must say. I mean, I think in part because there isn't a clear successor. We've got to remember back in 2014 when Salmon stepped down, he called Sturgeon his apprentice, and there was a coronation that basically led to her being the leader, which also means that we haven't actually had a leadership election, I think, into, the last time was 2004. So this is new territory. Other names, Angus Robertson, former Westminster leader, John Sweeney, who's also a former leader, but also the deputy first leader at the moment. Keith Brown, deputy leader of the party, but not deputy first leader. Who've I missed, Chris?
Hamza Youssef would be the other name that I'd probably throw in there, who is currently the health secretary in Scotland, although his fortunes have taken a bit of a dive along with Scottish NHS in recent months. But yeah, I know that he has always been ambitious and has been tipped as a potential future leader.
Who also introduced the controversial hate crime bill when he was Justice Secretary.
It's not a great track record.
No, his profile seems to increase with the increasing amount of controversy that surrounded him.
Yeah. And Chris, you profiled Kate Forbes for us fairly recently. Can you tell us a bit about her and, her prospects as a potential leader?
Yeah, she's absolutely fascinating. I mean, she's only just turned 33, so she's young. But then there has been a sort of, I guess, a record recently of youngish women taking over countries, whether it's New Zealand or Finland and others as well. So that might not count against her. She's a wee free, which is quite a fundamentalist Protestant religion, which is reflected, I think, in some of her social conservatism. And I think that, the SNP does see itself as a progressive party, and that might be something that she would have to get over. We all saw what happened to Tim Farron when he was leading the Lib Dems, and that kind of brought him down in a sense. I think Kate Forbes has been aware of that, and she's tried to speak about her religious views quite openly over the last couple of years, maybe to give them an airing and defang them slightly. I think she has also been of the opinion that, in some of these areas, well, some of them are reserved enemies, such as abortion, but in others, she would be more likely to reflect the country's general view than maybe what her own religion would dictate. I think what's impressed people about her is that at such a young age, and I know that Sturgeon rated her very highly as a potential successor, is that she has an incredible grasp of detail. So she's been running the economy and finance department for the past couple of years and has been really on top of her brief. Has brought some of the cabinet ministers around her who are older and more experienced, to heel asking them for cuts in their budgets because obviously money's been tighter. She's tried to save the Scottish government money around the place. She shows the signs of being a bit more cautious with the taxpayers' money, which hasn't really been something the SNP have been particularly bothered about up till now. I think she's very open to ideas. She is, I guess, not afraid of conversations about wealth creation, not because she's a right-winger, but because if you want to properly fund public services, you need the tax revenues coming in, and the best way to do that is to have a thriving private sector that will pay those tax revenues. I would probably say if she wasn't in the SNP, she'd sit relatively comfortably in the mainstream of the Labour Party. But I think if you're young and ambitious in Scotland, or have been in recent years, there'd be no point joining the Labour Party. You join the SNP because that's the route to power. So we'll see what happens there. It may be a too big an ask for the SNP membership for those small C conservative reasons that we talked about. My view is that she would be the most competent. She's quite likeable, quite self-deprecating. She is obviously a different generation from Sturgeon and Salmond. I think she's got the ability to think for herself. And so when we're talking about rethinking the purpose of the SNP in government, rethinking the case for independence, I think she is the best of that generation. There are some other good people around in that generation, but she, from the ones I know, certainly is the outstanding candidate that has the intellectual smarts and the character to take the party down that route. That said, if I'm backing her, then she's probably doomed. I'm not sure I'm the SNP would listen to for the future direction. Yeah. But there are others. So Angus Robertson, as you said, Freddie, former leader at Westminster, very experienced, another very intelligent person. Angus has been around for a long time, and I don't know if that will count for him or against him. He does, and I think even his closest friends would admit that he can come across as a bit pompous from time to time. He's a man who likes to get on his back legs and talk to the room. But again, that's maybe not necessarily a bad thing. Keith Brown is often tipped, but he would be maybe, like Swinney, seen as a sort of safe pair of hands. He's a bit older, probably a bit closer to the Sturgeon generation. Would he have the sort of fire and the, I guess, the desire to make the changes that people like me think are needed. But as I said earlier, the SNP membership might not want that stuff. They might want to keep going, keep running at the barricades. So we'll see it. It's very hard to predict at the moment. And talking about maybe the next few years and what the consequences of Sturgeon going will be for the SNP in the polls and the independence movement and its public support for independence is probably quite an important part of that conversation as well. Losing Sturgeon, it leaves a very big hole. She was as popular with some as she was unpopular with others. Anyone who comes in now will not have her profile. That could be a bad thing for the independence movement, and certainly amongst the general public, who will think, well, we're now at tail end of an SNP government where they're giving us first ministers that we haven't heard of compared to Salmond and Sturgeon. Or the alternative is it could be a real burst of energy and a fresh face, and if they get the right person, there's public approval, they get a nice bounce coming out of it, they make a compelling argument for a change in strategy, they impress people by some of the hard decisions they take in government. So, it could go either way at the moment. People will have their views on that, but I'm kind of careful about making predictions at this stage, largely because all predictions have been wrong in politics since the Brexit vote really in Trump. So better to hold your fire.
And you never know who the membership will choose. I mean, Tim Bale, the academic who's an expert in party membership, he's just released everything he knows about the SNP membership, and they are, they skew very left wing, or at least, relatively left wing. So it could be that Kate Forbes might just be too much for them to swallow. But we'll see. We'll be following it on this podcast. Thanks so much for coming on, Chris. It was great to have you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.